بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you to this first panel discussion that will be addressing the key aspect of UBF information sharing platform. As been mentioned by the speakers and by Mr. Nasser, that the cyber attack is becoming a world challenge. It's not only for a organization, financial organization, but I think it's for the whole world. And it really requires collaboration and information sharing and what to do against them. Because they are collaborating with themselves and they're making it, easier and easier for them to attack financial institutions. For that reason, we need really to collaborate and to share information and not to hold information from others, and how to protect ourselves being unified in a way that really we can fight back this cyber attack. Without further ado, I would like to introduce my panelists in this interesting panel. To my left, Mr. Rinaldo Ribeiro. He is the head of IT Risk and GRC Risk Management and Commercial Bank of Dubai and UBF Information Security. And next to him is Mr. Hugh. He is the CEO of Anomali. And then Mr. John Morgan Salomon is the Financial Service ISIC. First of all, I would like, before I start, thanks the UBF for hosting such an interesting HIMAYA discussion today about cyber attack, and also Al-Iktissad Wal-Aamal for giving me the trust to moderate such an important session. I'll give each of the speakers 10 minutes to give his views on the sharing, if you will, of information, collaboration, and the importance of it for fighting back this kind of cyber attack. And then we'll have whatever remaining, around 50 minutes or so for Q&A. Mr. Please.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'm really happy and honored to be here today. We are live with the platform, but just before we talk about the platform, around 10, 11 years ago, we were 4 or 5 banks trying to figure out a way of sharing, trying to figure out a way of sharing data about threats. And of course, since 2005, 2006, we have been sharing data in so many different ways. So the key point here today is we have a sharing platform today that allows the banks to share information about threats, and realizing that the cyber criminals are working together. They do collaborate, they do share information. They have their own groups and ways of working to commit fraud and to commit crime. It goes in a very clear way that we as banks in the country and in the region should be doing the same. So today I'm happy to say that we have the platform live. It's hosted in the country, which means that for some of us as banks would be more comfortable not using some of the cloud service there. So that was one of the key points that we had with our partners. It's hosted currently with Du, and we're able to have secure access to the platform and share data. So the key point is when one attack is happening against Bank A, it should take hours and not weeks to have okay, let's say even if you say days and not weeks, to have the details about that, of that particular attack. Not long back, we had a major, compromise in one of the banks here, and literally some of us, we got this information weeks later. And sometimes it's not only how they operate, how that attack was performed, but also the key data points that would allow us to search for similar attacks, that would allow us to see if that particular threat actor or that particular group was targeting us as a bank as well. So it's having quick access to actionable data. So one thing is I have information from an attack happening in any other country currently. The other thing is having an attack, a real attack happening with a bank next door a few hours ago. So that is the goal at the end, right? And as of now, we call this as phase 1, which means we are live with the UBF members. Phase 2 would be opening to the whole country, where all the members and all the banks will be able to join. And as one of the key points from day 1, we'll be opening to the region as well. So those are points that we definitely have to talk about. I know that many of our colleagues today are from different countries here, and this is a common point. So I don't want to take much more time.
Well, Mr. Rinaldo, before I move to Mr. Hugh, how did you find this collaboration, this platform, Musharaka, and how many banks are involved now, and what do you expect the next step, and what is the benefit of it, basically?
Yeah, so we have the Information Security Committee today, which is a committee with 13 members, and that's what
3-0?
1-3.
1-3, okay.
Yeah, 13.
All right.
And that is what we call phase 1. So phase 1 is we are live with the platform, with secure access to that platform, and that's what we are currently. Phase 2 will be opening to all the members in the country, and possibly phase 3 opening to other institutions in the region as well.
And you see the benefit that's taking place already?
Definitely. I mean, so this is just the beginning. I mean, we need to be clear that the key challenges would start now, right? So having the platform as a way to share data is a great milestone. It's important to have a proper way, standardized, using known standards, and the platform, I'm sure we will be able to talk a bit more about the platform, but the platform would allow access to other feeds and actionable data that would benefit the banks as well. But the point, I guess, is having the platform is the first step. The actual sharing and to realize the benefits of sharing is something that is about to start. So we are starting this now, and this is something that would very soon be able to have more value out of the platform.
Thank you very much. I'll move to Mr. Hugh. What is your experience being from the Anomali, with the UAE Banking Federation establishing such an interesting really platform to share, and exchange information and get the benefit out of it, please?
Yeah. It's a very powerful concept. So first, I think I would like to maybe explain why threat intelligence itself is useful. If you compare to when you're protecting your own house, a lot of people have burglar alarms and detection systems. And those are similar in the cybersecurity world to something like a firewall or an intrusion detection system. So if somebody knocks on your door, maybe they're going to break into your house, or maybe they're a legitimate visitor, but you don't know until maybe they break a window, break a lock, then the intrusion alarm can go off. So that's what I would call direct monitoring, direct observation, and that's very important. Where threat intelligence comes in and makes the entire system more powerful is if somebody experiences an intrusion and they take some identifiable data about the bad actor, the criminal, like the fingerprints, the photo, maybe the ID, and share that information with the neighborhood, then other houses can actually identify that there's a threat when the person first knocks on the door. So with only direct observation, you can only respond to threats that you have already experienced or after the breach happens. With threat intelligence, you can actually arm yourself and your neighbors to be able to respond before a threat is consummated, before the breach actually pays off. This is a very powerful concept. The two things go hand in hand. When you do the original detection by direct observation, you have an opportunity to add information for the community and share it. A lot of people actually understand this in principle and think it is a good thing. Where it starts to get a little more complicated is when you ask them to share in both directions. People don't mind receiving some information, but the system is more powerful if everybody shares and consumes. And so this is why it's very exciting to see a group of forward-thinking banks here that are actually deciding to come on board and collaborate with each other. And I think this is going to expand throughout the region. But the idea is to make it a much shorter time between one entity being breached and then everybody having a defense. That's really where the usefulness of this comes in. And once you have that capability, there are many other things that can be done using this sort of threat intelligence. For example, one application is you hear about a new breach. Once that type of breach or actor has been identified, you can actually go back through your archives, through all of your logs and records, and find out when was this first seen on your network and which of your systems was patient 0. So this allows you to very quickly establish a timeline and understand the scope and the magnitude of the breach and what needs to be done to remediate. And this is just one example, so I think I'll stop there.
Oh, yeah. In fact, you mentioned a very important thing, and it's all what you have said is important, but you said some of the organizations, they like to give, receive, not to give. And some of the countries, you probably know the confidentiality of the banking sector, not to reveal any information. How would you think that we could deal with this very critical aspect?
Sure. So there are different reasons. Not all of the reasons are wrong. A lot of them make sense. So for example, if you have an organization like a bank, and you have employees from that bank talking to another bank, often the legal counsel within the bank will be afraid that there's going to be sharing of IP, like competitive information leakage, or even that somebody is stealing information from the bank. So that's a legitimate concern. The reason we are implementing a very specific structured platform here is because having that structure makes it very easy for the banks to ascertain that the only kind of information that is being shared is security and threat related, as opposed to corporate IP, where a leak would be bad. So the first thing is to have tools that culturally make it easier to do the right thing. The other thing is a lot of times there is a circular problem where people are reluctant to share because maybe they feel other entities also only want to consume. And so there needs to be a level of trust that it's a two-way street. And I think part of the way that gets solved is people get on the platform. Maybe initially they start consuming intelligence. And once they see the value, then I think they feel more comfortable proactively sharing back into the system. So I think the first thing is to understand that this is a valuable capability, and then afterwards it will be natural to say, well, I've seen something, let me contribute back into the system. Another reason people are worried about contributing is sometimes they're not confident that their contribution will be at the same level of expertise or skill. But all of these things get built one incident at a time, and so starting with what you have is the natural path to grow.
In other words, we should look at the total picture and not be narrow-minded. And,
yes.
Okay. So, John, we were talking in the break, how could would it be compulsory or would it be voluntary to be member of any platform, whether being the platform that's been established in UAE or otherwise? How could we promote the concept of being, voluntary, that it's good for me to be a member of such platform?
Well, fundamentally, I don't personally believe that mandatory participation or sharing, especially in an area sensitive as threat intelligence or security threat data, is the best way forward. We've seen this in a lot of areas of our activity around the world. What you want to avoid is this becoming a tick box exercise. You want to avoid this becoming a compliance exercise. An organization should share information because it wants to, because there's value in it. As Hugh was pointing out, this is an organic process. This is something that grows over time. It has to be, mutually or even multilaterally understood that we as an organization have a value in providing our experiences, our observables back to the rest of the community. And in what we've seen worldwide, I think generally it's not unreasonable to assume a path of between 3 to 5 years, learning and internalizing the logic of sharing being something necessary. an internal part of every organization's capabilities and their DNA, their cultural identity, as it were, in terms of how they interact with their peers in both locally and internationally in helping to fight threats. What I think would be a good idea is before we even start talking about platform or sharing or intelligence, is to quickly address a few fundamental topics. Because if I were to tell a story leading up to what for me is the highest level of maturity an organization can attain in the security field, and that is sharing with their peers, working as a community together to fight these threats and to reduce their own risk, there's a couple of capabilities that every organization, I think, should be aware of. And in my experience in this field, those start at people. Hire good people, trust them, pay them good salaries, empower them at all levels of management, and that is from your team lead all the way up to your C-level. Because these are the people who are then going to themselves take initiative and take ownership, not just identifying issues, but actually doing something about them. The previous speaker made a very good point about the small number of cybercrime cases being investigated. Part of this is because staff are limited. They don't have enough time. Very often they try to tick something off and move on to the next one because they're under pressure. Quick show of hands in here, which organization has enough staff or resources in their security group? Yeah, thought so. Second point is risk. Very, very few people and even fewer organizations understand risk fundamentally. In order to be able to understand the need to collaborate with your peers, you want to understand risk, you want to live risk. You want to realize that everything feeds into business risk, even specific areas such as cyber risk. Working with your staff, working with your business peers, and understanding the business processes underlying why risk is relevant will help you understand why you want to share out and also benefit from your peers sharing intelligence. This also ties into staff. Hire the best staff. Make sure they can provide consulting services from end to end when you're working with the third aspect I want to address, and that's security assurance. Make sure your code testing, your pen testing, your developer education, your internal consulting, understand all aspects of technology. Make sure that you're really you're ensuring that your technology platforms, your security processes, even your user awareness provide a secure foundation for reduced exposure to advanced threats out in the world today. Once we have these, we move on to the last topic, and that is sharing, and that's intelligence sharing. Remember, when we talk about intelligence, it's not data, it's not indicators. It's actually processed, contextualized information, where we not only understand what do these lists of IPs or malware hashes and checksums mean to my organization, but what have my peers out in the world seen with these? And this is where exactly this aspect of not just consuming but sharing out comes into play. Because only by sharing information via whatever platform you choose to use shows that you are able to work together with your peers in the industry to reduce the overall risk. Initially, only a few organizations will share. This is natural. It takes a long time to get over this you mentioned a very, very common issue, which is legal staff. What's the lawyer's first response when you ask them if you can share something? One word?
No.
2 letters? Precisely. That takes time to get over. When an organization begins to understand the value of having the contextual information from their peers, what does this attack mean to us? And what threat scenario do these observables, these IOCs feed into? That's when you really start to build a sharing ecosystem. The only way to accomplish that is trust. As banal as it sounds, I think events like these, face-to-face meetings, but also more informal gatherings are a way to build that trust, to encourage people to start sharing technical data on a day-to-day basis, whether it's via a platform, whether it's via briefing calls, what have you. So it's an evolutionary process that requires a bunch of fundamental understandings and maturity levels, but I think ultimately, if all of us are aware of the end value to our organization of sharing information out and not only consuming it, you're going to realize that this is a very, very valuable resource for your organization.
Well, thank you, John. I think you have mentioned very good points regarding the sharing, but you were emphasizing, if I read you correctly, the training, the good pay for the staff, but also the risk assessment, would you believe that a platform should also engage itself in training, cross-training between the members of their staff and also risk assessment? What do you think?
I think a community should. Now, I use that term on purpose rather than platform. I obviously have an interest in this. I work for the FSI SAC globally, which is a nonprofit, member-driven community run by the financial services industry for the goal of reducing the systemic risk from various types of threats.
And that's a voluntary thing, right?
It's
okay.
a voluntary,
non-profit.
it's member-driven. We have about 7,000 members in over 80 countries around the world. When I talk about information sharing, it's as much about capability sharing as anything else. It's not just cyber threat intelligence, it's also best practices. It's how do we deal with broader trends? How do we deal with regulatory issues? How do we ensure that we as a community have access to a pool of good people by realizing, again, we're not on our own. We're not fighting on our own. You know, the instinct of a lot of companies, for example, you mentioned training, is, well, if we train young people out of university, well, then they'll leave once we train them. Sure, they probably will. That's a good thing. Because if all of your colleagues are doing this as well, then we're working together to make sure that we have a talent pool. The same with risk management. If we're sharing information about risks, but also about risk management and assessment practices, that means that all of our constituent organizations will have access to the same knowledge. Remember, if you're doing this right, the ultimate goal should be, let the money guys do the money thing, let them do the business thing. Our role is to provide a safe environment for them to be able to compete as bankers. Fundamentally, if we're collaborating in all of these aspects, we're creating a collective ecosystem where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. In all of these aspects that you mentioned, staffing, risk awareness, threat awareness, good practices, any of these that you can imagine, as long as we're all feeding back into this.
Thank you, John. Thank you for the speakers, and I think the conclusion that I did get, I hope that you got the same, is collaboration is important, information sharing is important, not to work singly because at the end of the day it's a threat for all of us. Well, I have like 50 minutes or so. I can open the floor for questions, so please, Mr. Adnan.
Thank you very much. This is really, I mean, a very good information for me as a banker. I'm not very close to the IT, but I think that now I'm starting to learn a little bit. On the risk sharing and on the information which is disclosed by you, I think that also that we have to take into consideration sometime the legal system in each country, because you know that we as banks, we are also controlled by the central banks, and sometimes certain information, maybe I wish to disclose it or share it with the others, but central banks does not allow it. As a matter of fact, sometimes also within the Gulf countries, if you have a bank or you have a branch in one country, the information in that branch, although that it is your branch, you cannot transfer it to the head office because they say that this is something which is confidential. So I don't know how you can come through or out from this kind of restriction. Thank you very much.
Mr. Ho, what do you think? Sometimes in central banks and the confidentiality of sharing information, how would you deal with it?
So I think it's important to work within the constraints, whether they are regulatory or other institutions that have control over certain aspects of things. But it's also important to realize there are different categories of information that can be shared. And if those agencies do not fully see the nuances or the differences, for example, you may have customers, there's account information, there are regulations against sharing that makes sense. But when we're talking about bad actors, just like with the police, then it's important to defend your customers. And to defend your customers, you may have to share information. And so identifying those kind of cases and educating the respective agencies can lead to adjustments in the regulations and controls.
Mr. Nasser, I would like Your Excellency hear your views on that. The central banks and how could we...
As Mr. Adnan said, we as banks are regulated by central bank as well as, the law within the country. So the regulatory and legal environment is very important for banks, and it dictates the extent to which the kind of information can be shared. So certainly this is a constraint which we have to observe as banks. Now for this platform, what I have understood since the start, that the kind of information which is being shared, first it's anonymous. Second, it's not explicit in terms of mentioning, or violating the regulations, or it's within the law and within the limits of the regulations dictated in the country. So, but I believe, yes, after all, the law prevails. We as banks should commit to the laws and regulations, and we'll go by that.
Nahla Al-Bloushi from Central Bank of Oman.
Okay.
My question comes again to the same thing, which is, what is the role of the regulator in the information sharing process, just to ensure that whatever is shared is the right information to be shared? Maybe the central bank need to be involved in the platform in somehow?
Okay.
Thank you.
We have been working closely with the central bank. I believe every country would have its own restrictions and possibly more flexible or not towards sharing, but it's very critical to know that the type of data that's being shared and how the cyber criminals operate. So first of all, it's not about sharing PII or customer data. It's about to share actionable data that would allow the community and the banking community to protect against new threats. In our role in the country, working closely with the central bank helped a lot. We got their support, not only on the principles, but also willing to be part of the sharing platform. In my view, in the whole region, that same model should be applied and could be applied. I don't see a reason not to. We understand being here that certain countries would be more strict in terms of the regulations around software as a service, cloud service, and all that, and sharing. But once you establish the proper scope and the benefits, that becomes a much easier process.
Just allow me to pass my humble experience. What we do in Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Arabian Monetary Agency, SAMA, we have formed a sort of security, information security committee that incorporate all of the banks working in Saudi. And we have also, SAMA sits on that committee, and where we exchange views. And SAMA's opinion, like His Excellency Mr. Adnan has said, this is a red line, that this is a red signal that everybody has to cooperate. And I think no central bank on earth would say, don't exchange information. That would really protect banks from being victim to any kind of attack. From the back.
Hussein Khalsan from Commercial Bank of Dubai. My question is to Hugh, maybe first to hear his view. He mentioned a good point about, consuming but not sharing back. And my point is that I guess the concern more from mostly the banks is that I want to share it, but provided you tell me that I will be anonymous. And honestly, in my view, I don't believe that that should be the case, and I believe that's wrong. Why not? So why not share and tell yourself? Because in day-to-day, we all share information with each other to protect ourselves, to protect the people we love, and even to protect the community. So I don't really believe what's the real concern of sharing a bad thing, but being anonymous. Unless you are really threatened to be killed or something like that, which I don't believe the case. Okay. But, sharing a bad thing, but being anonymous, I don't really understand that concept. But, I still would like to hear Hugh's view and also his experience, maybe, from what he's seeing around.
Sure. Okay. Very good question. So, I think it's important to remember the benefit that we're trying to get when we share the information. And the idea is to take away the element of surprise from the attackers, from the bad guy. So basically, the first bank that they victimize can legitimately be surprised. But if there are 50 other banks to go after, that should not be 50 surprises. The reason to share the information is to remove the advantage the attacker has after the first time. And I think all the banks would agree this would be a good thing, because when the customers get scared or feel unsafe putting their money in a bank, they won't move it to another bank, they'll move it under the mattress in their home. So all banks lose if the trust in the system is eroded. So the other part is, you mentioned some banks agree it's good to share, but they want to be anonymous. In a sense, that can actually be fine. And one way to look at it is, let's say you have a group of banks. We call them trusted circles. So maybe you have 13 banks, maybe you have 40 banks in the circle. But the idea is that you know who all the members are. The reason a bank might want to be anonymous when sharing the information is they don't want somebody to say they got breached. Okay, that's fine. There's two separate goals. One is not admitting you were breached. The other is helping your community to be safe. So I think it's fine to provide the functionality that a bank that is inside a known group could anonymously share information, because we know it's one of the trusted banks. We know it's one of these 13 banks or one of these 40 banks. We don't have to know which one. So in other words, we know it's a group we trust. Somebody in there experienced this breach. They're willing to share it. They don't want us to know which specific one. I think we can support that if it makes people more comfortable sharing.
So John, I'd like to hear your views. Should we have like an SLA sort of agreement or confidentiality disclosure? What do you think, to make it easy for us to, to share the information?
First of all, thank you for that point.
That's very important.
Very welcome, because it's always welcome when somebody believes in the concept of openly sharing information with their peers. I believe it has to be voluntary. I agree. I believe the mechanism should be there to allow for anonymous disclosure, anonymous sharing of any information. Making something mandatory helps nobody. We've seen this in the US, where there's a regulatory directive for all financial organizations to join FSISAC. It was challenging for all involved because we had thousands of small institutions. The same way, when you're talking about what do you have to share, either in an organization by its own rules or by regulatory directive, what you're doing is you're forcing people into processes which they might not be organically familiar with or ready for. So by making it possible for an organization to share something anonymously, you're allowing them to provide more information than they might otherwise. Remember, again, what I said before is that it's a learning process, it's a developing process for most organizations over years to feel comfortable with sharing information out into a community. You want to make it possible for them to use as many channels and formats as possible. Initially, they might be sharing stuff without their name on it. If you have, as Hugh was saying, a trusted circle, you understand who's in that trusted circle. So by extension, you trust that organization it's coming from, even if you don't know which one of those 13 or 40 or however many it is. We have over 7,000. But you're augmenting the amount of information available to everybody, which means that you have more context, and you're able to really create more thorough intelligence, not just data being shared, by making sure that you have more inputs into that big blob of information that's out there.
Mr. Rinaldo, what is the real experience says? You have 13 banks on the platform. Do some banks a little bit, ticklish about it?
Yes, I think in any group you'd have some that are more concerned.
I guess this is human nature, huh?
Yes, no,
Kicks in.
No, it is. So, but we wanted to make sure that as a platform, this would allow, and that would be optional. Overall, that should not be a concern for most of the banks. But yes, we do have some banks that are not willing to share unless it's fully anonymous.
Yeah, but I agree with Mr. Rowe. It is not a market information. It's not a customer information. It's for everyone information. Anyway, you have a question over there, please, Mike. I have like 2 more questions to go.
All right, I'll be quick on that one. Sana Rashid from HSBC. My question is, we all here for information sharing, right? And we know that the platform is already live. So currently, what do you feel are the challenges, and how would you overcome that, and by when?
Challenges in what? In sharing information? Yeah? Rinaldo, maybe from, again, experience.
Yeah, so as I said earlier, it's a milestone, but it's just the beginning, right? So information sharing is not a new concept. The platform, in Tasharuk, am I saying?
Tasharuk, yeah,
Tasharuk,
yeah.
I don't want to pronounce properly in Arabic. It's a platform. FS ISAC has been there for more than 10 years, I guess. I mean, and some of us in the room are members, and we choose to consume and/or contribute to that bigger forum. What we are creating now is something localized to our context, smaller, trusted circles that is right now in the phase one. So the challenges are to educate some of the banks around what to share, how to share, of course, the mechanics on how to use the platform. There are different ways of integrating that could be discussed later on. So how do I automate some of that sharing? Should I do that or not? How do I consume back into my internal controls and technology that we have? But first is awareness. Educating users on the importance if some of us might not be fully aware, which is, I find very difficult to believe, but, and then, starting the journey. I mean, we are in the first few steps, and I'm pretty confident that would be a successful journey.
Excellent. So John, you have a
And
comment?
I think this actually goes back very nicely to what the gentleman in the front was saying about regulatory issues and central banks. If a central bank or regulator can show the way and clarify to their constituent organizations what is permissible and what is encouraged, we're facing this challenge massively in Europe right now with GDPR. It's a very, very well-meaning legislation, but people don't really understand at an operational level what it means to them. If the central banks and the regulators can work together with the commercial organizations, the banking federations, the CERTs, et cetera, to clarify what this means and take a leading role by themselves sharing information about the cyber threats that are hitting them operationally, then that's going to dramatically encourage the commercial ecosystem to become more active in pushing out information because they see somebody with a leading role inspiring them to actively engage in a platform or a community.
I committed myself to the organizer to stick to the time. I have final question to take. Please, sir. Mike over there, please. We can't hear you.
I'm Hari Prasad from National Bank of Ribeiro. Many of the, as the panelists told, that many of the organizations have the issues with regards to the resources in the cybersecurity unit. Does anywhere in the world where this kind of sharing platform is used for after the incident response, because they will not be having all the resources how to tackle that particular incident. They might have identified after, as per the standards, 170 days or whatever it is. But do they have the resources how to handle? Does this kind of platform has helped them to reduce this particular kind of the attack or address this kind of the attacks?
John, you have talked about the resources.
Yeah, absolutely.
Please.
And one of the goals of a community like what's being developed in the UAE is, hopefully more broadly, what we've seen with FSISAC worldwide is that it increases the ROI of these limited resources available to you. There's two types of interaction fundamentally. The first one is help. I'm seeing something, what is it? Help me. And the second one is, by the way, I saw this, I had a look at it, and this is what it means. When you combine those two types of interactions, all of a sudden, again, the limited resources I pointed out before become a community. You have access to the knowledge and the experience and the resources and technologies and of your peers elsewhere in the world. We've seen this time and time again with attacks that are going over various continents, countries, evolving over time. The Dire and Drydex guys, for example, they're evolving their attacks over different geographic areas. Whereas one small organization all of a sudden is able to benefit, even if they're just consuming, from all the intelligence work that's been done by their peers from, for example, larger international banks. The reason why you want to participate in a community like this is that the more people share, the stronger the information becomes that allows organizations, even with smaller amounts of resources, to do their jobs more effectively, more efficiently, and more quickly, without having to worry so much about, do I have a 300-person security team that's on the job, because all of a sudden I have a 3,000-person cloud out there that's working together with me and that has exactly the same problem. And let me just finish up by saying that every single one of you here that has these challenges, well, every single one of you in here has these challenges because everybody else in the world has exactly the same issues. So if you work together, you're going to be able to augment and multiply that limited set of resources you've got tremendously. So I highly encourage that.
Let me add.
Please,
one.
Mr. Hall.
Yeah.
Please.
So one of the direct operational benefits of having access to the intelligence is after a breach, you can actually scan your systems to identify which of your systems were touched by given threats. And so it makes it a much more rapid process to mitigate and to decide which systems either need to be wiped and re-imaged, et cetera, because the idea is to use the intelligence to find the footprint of the attackers and where they've been in your networks. So that's a direct way that you can save a lot of effort post-breach.
I agree with the panelists. The human resource is always a challenge, with it being in financial security otherwise. But as you just mentioned, John, pay them well, train them well. I think they will make it at the end of the day. Well, I would love to stay more, but I exceeded my session by a couple of seconds. On behalf of the UBF and Al-Iktissad, I would like to thank the panelists for the interesting discussion that we had. Hope that you enjoyed it. And until we meet next time, inshallah, we're always protected from any cyber attack. Thank you very much all. Thank you.